The cold rain fell in sheets, blurring the world into a grey watercolour of grief. Ethan stood by the freshly turned earth, the cheap black suit he owned, soaked through, clinging to his skin like a second, colder layer. He felt a profound numbness, a hollowness where his father's quiet presence used to be. His wife, Serafina, stood a few feet away, sheltered under a large black umbrella held by her brother Julian. She had not shed a single tear. Her face, a mask of bored impatience, was fixed on the polished mahogany of the casket as it was lowered into the ground. Her mother, Eleonora, stood beside her, radiating a palpable disdain. She adjusted the collar of her ridiculously expensive fur coat and glanced at Ethan, her lips curled into a familiar sneer. To her, this entire affair was a distasteful duty, a social obligation to acknowledge the death of the man her daughter had inexplicably married. The service was mercifully short. As the few mourners began to disperse, Ethan lingered, wanting one last moment of peace. That peace was shattered when Serafina's sharp voice cut through the downpour. "Are you done yet, Ethan? We have a luncheon to attend. You can't possibly expect us to stand around in this dreadful weather all day." Ethan turned slowly, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. "I just wanted a minute, Sarah." Eleonora scoffed, a sound like tearing silk. "A minute for what? To contemplate your inheritance? I imagine there isn't much to contemplate. A dusty workshop and a pile of debts, I presume." Julian snickered, a cruel, wet sound. "Be nice, Mother. He might have inherited a priceless collection of wrenches." The casual cruelty of their words barely registered anymore. It had been the constant soundtrack to his 10-year marriage. He had endured it, believing that beneath Serafina's obsession with status and wealth, the woman he had fallen in love with still existed. He was a fool, He walked towards them, his shoes squelching in the mud. "I'm ready," he said quietly. Serafina looked him up and down, her eyes filled with disgust. "You're not getting in the car dressed like that. You look like a drowned rat. You'll ruin the leather." Ethan stopped, stunned. "It's my father's funeral, Serafina. It's raining. What did you expect?" "I expected you to have the decency to own a proper suit and an overcoat," Eleonora interjected, her voice dripping with venom. But that would require ambition, something your family has always sorely lacked. You can walk. It's not far." "Walk?" Ethan's voice was a whisper of disbelief. "You want me to walk home from my own father's funeral?" "It will give you time to think about making better life choices," Julian added, unlocking the doors to the gleaming black Bentley. He opened the rear door for his mother and sister, who slid in without a backward glance. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing the final closing of a chapter in his life. The engine purred to life, and the Bentley pulled away, its tires spitting muddy water onto Ethan's trousers. He stood there, alone in the rain-swept cemetery, the cold seeping deep into his bones. It was more than just the rain. It was a soul-deep chill of utter abandonment. This was his lowest point. This was the ultimate humiliation. As he stood shivering, his hand went to his pocket, closing around the only thing his father had given him before the end. It was not a wrench, but a heavy, ornate brass key. His father, weak and fading in the sterile hospital bed, had pressed it into his palm. "This is the key to everything, son," he had rasped, his eyes urgent. "The real family business. Don't let them see it. Don't trust them." At the time, Ethan had dismissed it as the ramblings of a dying man. His father was a simple carpenter, a man who found joy in the grain of wood and the precision of a well-made joint. What real family business could there be? Now, standing in the aftermath of his wife's devastating cruelty, the weight of the key in his hand felt different. It felt like a promise, a mystery. It was the only thing he had left. The walk home was long and miserable. Each step was a testament to his powerlessness. He saw his reflection in the shop windows he passed. A pathetic, drenched figure, a man utterly defeated. He had met Serafina in college. She had seemed so vibrant, so full of life. He was studying structural engineering, and she was in art history. He was captivated by her beauty and her apparent sophistication. Her family, the formidable Montgomery clan, were real estate magnates, their names synonymous with luxury developments and high society. He, on the other hand, came from nothing. His father was a widower who ran a small, bespoke furniture workshop out of their modest home. Ethan had worked alongside him since he was a boy, learning the value of hard work and integrity. He was proud of his roots, but he quickly learned that to the Montgomerys his background was a source of shame. They had tolerated him at first, assuming Serafina was going through a phase. When she announced their engagement, their tolerance turned to cold hostility. Eleanora had taken him aside, offering him a check with enough zeros to make his head spin if he would just disappear. He had refused, telling her he loved her daughter. She had laughed in his face. "Love doesn't pay for a penthouse, young man. It doesn't get you a table at the best restaurants. You will be her ruin." For 10 years, he had tried to prove her wrong. He worked a steady job as a civil engineer for the city, a respectable but hardly glamorous position. His salary was decent, but it was a pittance compared to the Montgomery fortune. Every penny he earned went towards maintaining the illusion that he was a worthy husband for Serafina. He paid for their apartment, the bills, the groceries. Serafina's family paid for her clothes, her cars, her endless social engagements. They treated him not as a son-in-law, but as a charity case they were forced to endure. They never missed an opportunity to remind him of his financial inadequacy. At family dinners, his father-in-law, Richard, would talk loudly about multi-million-dollar deals, while Julian would boast about his latest sports car. They would then turn to Ethan and ask, with faux sincerity, how his project to repair a municipal bridge was going. The condescension was a physical thing, thick and suffocating. He had borne it all for Serafina, hoping she would one day stand up for him. But she never did. She basked in her family's wealth and looked at him with an increasing disappointment, as if he were a failed investment. When his father fell ill, the cruelty escalated. Eleanora complained about the cost of the hospital, even though Ethan insisted on paying for it himself, draining his savings. Serafina visited her father-in-law only once, staying for 5 minutes and complaining about the smell of antiseptic. Now his father was gone, and with him the last buffer against the world's harshness. The incident at the cemetery was not an anomaly, it was a declaration. They were done pretending. In their eyes he was nothing, a piece of trash to be discarded. He finally reached the grand apartment building he and Serafina called home. The doorman, a kind man named George, looked at him with pity. "Mr. Miller, you're soaked to the bone. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, George," Ethan lied, his teeth chattering. The elevator ride up to the penthouse felt like an ascent to his own execution. He knew what was waiting for him. The key in his pocket felt heavier with each passing floor. When he opened the door, he found Serafina, Julian, and Eleanora sipping champagne in the living room. They were laughing about something. They stopped when they saw him, their smiles vanishing. "My God, you're dripping all over the Persian rug," Eleanora snapped. "Have you no consideration?" "I'm going to go change," Ethan said, his voice flat. "Don't bother," Serafina said, her tone cold and final. She gestured towards the large, ornate fireplace. A fire was roaring within it. Piled in front of the hearth were his clothes, his work shirts, his jeans, his few decent sweaters. Everything he owned was in that pile. "What is this?" he asked, though he already knew. "It's a cleansing," Serafina announced, a theatrical wave of her hand. "This apartment needs to be rid of your poverty. We're redecorating." "Starting with your wardrobe." With a flick of her wrist, she tossed her champagne flute into the pile. It shattered, the remaining liquid sizzling on the hot bricks. Then Julian, a cruel grin on his face, picked up a stack of Ethan's shirts and threw them into the flames. The smell of burning cotton filled the air. Ethan watched, paralyzed, as his life was turned to ash. It was a symbolic act, a final, brutal severing. They were not just getting rid of his clothes, they were erasing him. "You're a parasite, Ethan," Eleonora said, her voice low and menacing. "You latched onto our family hoping for a handout. Well, the charity has run its course. Serafina is filing for divorce. We've already spoken to the lawyers. You will get nothing. You came into this marriage with nothing, and you will leave with nothing," Serafina added, her eyes gleaming with a vindictive fire. "Now get out of my house." Something inside Ethan finally snapped. It was not a loud, explosive break, but a quiet, cold click. The years of suppressed anger, of swallowed pride, of enduring endless humiliation, all coalesced into a single point of icy resolve. He looked at their smug, hateful faces. He looked at the fire consuming the last vestiges of his old life, and he thought of the key in his pocket. His father's words echoed in his mind. Don't trust them, he finally understood. Without a word he turned and walked out of the apartment. He did not look back. He left the sound of their triumphant laughter behind him. He walked past a sympathetic George out into the continuing rain, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a single heavy brass key. He didn't have a destination. He just walked. The city lights smeared across his vision. For the first time, he felt truly alone, but also strangely liberated. The chains of his miserable marriage had been burned away in that fireplace. He found a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, paying for a room with the last bit of cash in his wallet. The room was small and smelled of stale smoke and despair. It was a fitting backdrop for the end of his world. He sat on the edge of the lumpy bed and took out the key. He examined it under the dim light of the bedside lamp. It was old, intricately carved with symbols he didn't recognize. On the head of the key, almost too small to see, was a small engraving, a stylized letter V intertwined with a compass rose. He had no idea what it meant. His father had been a carpenter. He fixed things, he built things. He was not a man of secrets or intrigue, or so Ethan had thought. The next morning, he used the motel's ancient desktop computer to start his investigation. He searched for the symbol, the V, and the compass rose. The search results were a cascade of corporate logos, historical insignias, and conspiracy theories. It was a dead end. He then focused on the key itself. It was a safe deposit box key, he realized. But for what bank? There were no markings. He remembered the papers his father had left him, a small bundle tied with twine that he'd stored in his office desk. He had to get them. Going back to the apartment was out of the question. He called his office, his voice hoarse. He told his boss he needed a few days off for a family emergency. Then he called a locksmith. He met the locksmith at his downtown office building late that night. He felt like a criminal, breaking into his own workspace, but he knew Serafina and her family would not hesitate to destroy anything that connected him to his past. Inside, he found the bundle of papers. They were old, brittle documents, property deeds for his father's small house and workshop, a will that left everything to him, and an envelope sealed with wax. The seal bore the same symbol as the key. His hands trembled as he broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of heavy parchment. It was a letter of deposit for a private bank he had never heard of. Valois and Sterling Private Trust. The address was in the city's most exclusive financial district, a world away from his modest life. He spent the rest of the night researching Valois and Sterling. There was almost no public information about them. They had no website, no advertisements. They were a ghost, a bank for the shadows, for the kind of old money that valued absolute discretion above all else. This was his father's secret, a secret he had kept for his entire life. Why? Meanwhile, in the Montgomery penthouse, the mood was celebratory. Serafina was on the phone with her new lover, a slick real estate developer named Marcus, a friend of Julian's. They were laughing about Ethan's pathetic exit.
"He just walked out like a stray dog you'd shooed from the porch," she giggled. "I can't believe I was ever married to such a weakling." Eleonora was already planning the divorce settlement. "Our lawyer says it's airtight. The prenuptial agreement gives him nothing. We'll even make him pay our legal fees. It will be the final humiliation." Richard, her husband, poured another round of expensive scotch. Their family company, Montgomery Holdings, was on the verge of its biggest deal yet, a massive downtown skyscraper project. It was a risky venture, leveraged to the hilt, but the potential payoff was astronomical. "Once this deal closes, we'll be in another league entirely," Richard boasted, "and we'll have finally cut the dead weight from this family." They were completely convinced of their own superiority, of their invincibility. They saw Ethan as a minor annoyance, a footnote in their grand story, already forgotten.
They had no idea that the foundation of their fragile empire was about to be shaken to its core. They were blissfully unaware that their biggest creditor, the silent financial partner who held the notes on all their major loans, was a discreet holding company called North Star Investments. And they had no idea that North Star Investments was merely a subsidiary of a much larger, far more powerful entity. An entity that, as of a few days ago, was solely owned by the man they had just thrown out into the rain. The next day, Ethan put on the only clothes he had left, the damp suit from the funeral. He took a bus to the financial district. He felt completely out of place as he walked among the power brokers in their tailored suits. He found the address from the letter. It was a discreet, imposing limestone building with no name on the door, only a small, polished brass plaque with the V and compass rose symbol. He took a deep breath and pushed the heavy door open. The interior was silent and cathedral-like. The air smelled of old money, leather, and wood polish. A single, elderly man sat behind a vast mahogany desk. He looked up, his expression neutral. "May I help you?" His voice was quiet, but carried authority. Ethan's voice felt small in the cavernous space. I have an appointment. My name is Ethan Miller." He held up the key and the letter. The man's demeanor changed instantly. A look of respectful recognition flickered in his eyes. He stood up. "Of course, Mr. Miller. We have been expecting you. My name is Mr. Thompson. I was your father's legal counsel and the executor of his estate. Please, come this way." He led Ethan through a series of hushed corridors and into a large, book-lined office. The room was dominated by a large portrait of a stern-looking man from a century ago. Mr. Thompson gestured for Ethan to sit in a plush leather armchair. "Your father was a remarkable man, Ethan," Mr. Thompson began, his voice gentle. "He was also one of the most private men I have ever known." "He was a carpenter," Ethan said, the words sounding hollow even to himself. Mr. Thompson smiled faintly. That was his passion, his hobby. It was not his business. The Miller family has been in the business of logistics and global shipping for over 200 years. They called it the Vanguard Group. Your father was the 5th generation to lead it. Ethan stared at him, uncomprehending. Vanguard? I've never heard of it. And you were never meant to, Mr. Thompson explained. After a series of hostile takeover attempts in the early 20th century, your great-great-grandfather restructured the entire enterprise. He broke it into hundreds of smaller, anonymous companies, all controlled by a central private trust. It operates in the shadows, a silent giant. It owns ports, shipping lines, air freight fleets, and a network of financial institutions to manage its capital. He slid a thick binder across the desk towards Ethan. This is a summary of the primary assets. The full accounting would fill this room. Ethan opened the binder. His eyes widened as he scanned the pages. The numbers were staggering, incomprehensible. He saw names of companies he recognized, global brands, all listed as subsidiaries. He saw real estate holdings on every continent, and he saw the name of a small investment firm, North Star Investments. North Star, Ethan breathed. Yes, said Mr. Thompson, one of our more active domestic investment arms. They specialize in commercial real estate development. He paused, his gaze sharp. They are the primary financiers for a company called Montgomery Holdings. The room seemed to spin. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening thud. The Montgomerys' wealth, their arrogance, their entire empire, it was all built on money from his family. His money. My father, why did he let me live like that? Why didn't he tell me? Ethan's voice was filled with a mix of awe and anguish. He wanted you to grow up without the poison of immense wealth, Mr. Thompson said softly. He saw what it did to people. He wanted you to learn the value of a day's work, to understand the world from the ground up. He wanted you to be a good man before you became a rich one. He was testing you in his own way. He continued, he was also testing your wife and her family. He knew their reputation. He allowed them to borrow from us, to build their little empire on our foundation, to see what they were truly made of. He was disappointed. Disappointed was an understatement. They were vultures, feeding on a carcass they didn't even realize was owned by the man they despised. The irony was so thick, so cruel, it was almost suffocating. According to your father's last will and testament, Mr. Thompson said, his tone becoming formal, upon his death, you, as his sole heir, assume full and total control of the Vanguard Group and all its assets, effective immediately. He pushed a single document and a pen across the desk. Your signature here will formalize the transfer of authority. Ethan looked at the paper. His name was typed neatly at the bottom. This was the moment, the decision point. He could walk away, try to forget everything he had just learned, or he could pick up the mantle of his family's legacy. He thought of his father's funeral. He thought of Seraphina's cold eyes, of Julian's sneer, of his clothes burning in the fireplace. He thought of the 10 years of humiliation he had endured. The cold resolve he had felt in the apartment solidified into something harder, sharper. It was not just about revenge anymore. It was about justice. It was about honoring his father, who had been judged and dismissed by these shallow, cruel people. He picked up the pen. The weight of it felt immense, a scepter of unimaginable power. His hand did not shake as he signed his name. The ink was black and final. When he looked up, Mr. Thompson was smiling. Welcome aboard, Mr. Miller. Now, what is your first order of business? Ethan leaned back in the chair, a feeling of calm authority settling over him. For the first time in his life, he felt truly powerful, not because of the money, but because the fog of deception had lifted. He saw the world and his place in it with perfect clarity. My first order of business, Ethan said, his voice steady and cold, is a comprehensive audit of all accounts associated with Montgomery Holdings. I want every loan, every line of credit reviewed. and I want to know our options for immediate recall." Mr. Thompson's smile widened. "I have already taken the liberty of preparing that file." He produced another binder, this one a fiery red. "Their finances are a house of cards, Mr. Miller. They are over-leveraged to a catastrophic degree. A single push is all it will take." "Then let's push," Ethan said. The plan they formulated was simple, elegant, and ruthless. It was a surgical strike, using the Montgomerys' own greed and arrogance as the weapon. They would not come in with guns blazing. They would dismantle their world brick by brick, using the very legal and financial systems they revered. The first step was a series of official-looking letters. The first domino. A formal notice from North Star Investments was dispatched to Richard Montgomery's office. It informed him that due to a portfolio-wide risk reassessment, his company's primary revolving credit line, the lifeblood of their day-to-day operations, was being recalled. Full payment was due in 30 days. Richard Montgomery read the letter and laughed. He thought it was a clerical error, a mistake by some junior analyst. He called his contact at North Star, a man he had wined and dined for years. The man's number was disconnected. Panic began to set in. He called other numbers higher up the chain. He was met with polite but firm stonewalls. No, it was not a mistake. Yes, the recall was final. No, the reason could not be disclosed. He stormed home that evening, his face pale with a mixture of rage and fear. "Someone is trying to ruin me," he roared, slamming the letter down on the marble countertop of the kitchen. Eleonora, Seraphina, and Julian gathered around, their expressions turning from annoyance to alarm as they read the letter.
"This is impossible," Julian said. "North Star needs us. That skyscraper project is their golden goose as much as it is ours." "Call our lawyers," Eleonora commanded. "Sue them. This has to be a breach of contract." But their lawyers brought even worse news. The loan agreements were ironclad. A small clause, buried deep in the boilerplate text, gave the lender the right to recall the full amount at their discretion for any reason. It was a standard clause, one they had never paid any attention to, so confident were they in their relationship with the lender. This was just the beginning. The cascade effect started almost immediately. News of the credit recall, leaked strategically to financial news outlets by an anonymous source, spooked their other investors. Partners in the skyscraper project began pulling out, demanding their seed money back. Their stock price, once a source of immense pride, began to plummet. The second blow came a week later.
Julian was called into his boss's office at the investment bank where he worked. He was suspended pending an internal investigation into insider trading and financial irregularities related to the Montgomery Holdings account. The tip-off had come from an anonymous but highly detailed email. Julian was aghast. He had been skimming, of course, everyone did. But to be caught? It was unthinkable. His career, the source of his smug superiority, was destroyed in an afternoon. The social ruin followed the financial ruin. Invitations to galas and charity balls suddenly stopped arriving. Friends they had known for years were suddenly unavailable for lunch. The Montgomerys were becoming toxic, and the high society world they worshipped had no tolerance for failure. Through it all, Ethan played his part perfectly. He had moved into a modest but comfortable long-stay hotel, funded by a personal account Mr. Thompson had set up for him. He called Seraphina every few days, feigning concern. "I heard about what's happening with your father's company," he'd say, his voice full of practiced sympathy. "Is there anything I can do? I don't have much, but I could lend you a few $100s. His offers were met with sputtering rage. "A few $100s?" Seraphina shrieked into the phone. "My family is losing billions and you offer me pocket change. You are more useless than I ever imagined." Her fury was music to his ears. Each insult was a confirmation that he was doing the right thing. He was holding up a mirror to their rotten souls, and they could not stand the reflection. He watched their downfall from a distance, a ghost pulling the strings of their destruction. Mr. Thompson provided daily updates. The repossession of their cars, the Bentley, Julian's Ferrari, Eleanora's Rolls-Royce, the freezing of their personal bank accounts. The foreclosure notices being prepared for their multiple properties, including the penthouse apartment. They grew more and more desperate. They tried to sell assets, but their portfolio was so entangled in debt that everything was worthless. They tried to call in favors, but found they had no real friends, only transactional acquaintances who had now vanished. Their world had shrunk until the only place they had left was the penthouse, a gilded cage where they paced and snarled at each other, assigning blame. It was Richard's fault for being so reckless. It was Julian's for getting caught. It was Seraphina's for marrying the bad luck charm that was Ethan. The final act was set. Mr. Thompson's legal team had finalized the foreclosure on the penthouse. The eviction date was set. Ethan decided it was time for the final confrontation. He wanted to be there to see the light of understanding dawn in their eyes. He wanted to watch them realize who had done this to them. He arrived at the apartment building on the designated day. George, the doorman, looked at him with surprise. "Mr. Miller, it's good to see you, sir. I heard about the troubles with the Montgomerys." "I heard about them too, George," Ethan said calmly. "I'm just here to pick up a few things I left behind." He rode the elevator up one last time. The silence was heavy with anticipation. He could hear them shouting inside before he even reached the door. He used his old key, which surprisingly still worked. He opened the door and stepped inside. The scene was one of utter chaos. Boxes were everywhere, furniture was draped in sheets, and in the center of the room stood Seraphina, Julian, and Eleanora, their faces pale and strained. They were arguing with two grim-faced men in suits, the bank's representatives. They all stopped and stared at him as he entered. "What are you doing here?" Seraphina spat, her voice ragged. "Have you come to gloat? To see us, brought low?" "I told you he was bad luck," Eleanora hissed, her eyes wild. "This is all his fault. He brought this curse upon us." Ethan ignored them and walked towards the fireplace. He looked at the ashes, the last remnants of his old life. He felt a strange sense of closure. "You have no right to be here," Julian snarled, taking a step towards him. "This is private property, for now." "Actually," Ethan said, turning to face them, his voice calm and clear, "I think I have every right." Seraphina laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "You have nothing. You are nothing. We are losing everything, and you still have the audacity to show your face? I am so glad I burned your pathetic clothes. It was the best thing I ever did." She grabbed a small box from a nearby table. It contained a few of his personal effects she had missed. Some old photos, a university diploma, a book his father had given him. "Here's the rest of your worthless junk," she screamed. And, in a fit of pique, she hurled the contents of the box into the cold fireplace. "Now get out. Get out of my life forever." It was at that precise moment that the real show began. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, a procession of vehicles could be seen coming up the long, private driveway. It was not one or two cars, but a fleet. 20 sleek, black, armored SUVs, their tinted windows hiding their occupants, moved with the silent, menacing grace of a predator. They pulled to a stop in a perfectly synchronized formation in the building's circular driveway. Doors opened in unison, and men in dark, impeccably tailored suits emerged. They moved with a purpose and discipline that spoke of elite security and immense power. Seraphina, Julian, and Eleanora stared, their argument forgotten. The bank representatives looked confused. "What is that?" Eleanor whispered, a new kind of fear in her voice. "Is it the police?"
"Are they here to arrest us?" The lead vehicle's passenger door opened and Mr. Thompson stepped out. He adjusted his tie and walked towards the building's entrance with an unhurried stride. The Montgomerys watched, mesmerized by the display of overwhelming force. They couldn't comprehend what was happening. Their minds, so attuned to the nuances of wealth and power, recognized this as a level of influence far beyond anything they had ever witnessed. A moment later, the apartment's buzzer rang. One of the bankmen answered it. After a brief, muffled conversation, he looked over at the family, his expression bewildered. "There's a Mr. Thompson here to see, Mr. Miller?" All eyes snapped back to Ethan. He stood there, perfectly calm, a small, knowing smile on his face. The pieces began to fall into place in their minds, but the picture they formed was so impossible, so ludicrous, that they couldn't accept it.
The door opened and Mr. Thompson entered, followed by two imposing security guards. He walked directly to Ethan, ignoring everyone else in the room. He inclined his head respectfully. "Sir," he said, his voice ringing with deference, "your transport is ready? We have secured the airfield for your departure." The silence in the room was absolute. It was a silence so profound it felt like the air had been sucked out of the building. Seraphina's mouth hung open. Eleanor's face was a mask of utter disbelief. Julian looked as if he had been struck by lightning. What is going on?" Seraphina stammered, looking from Ethan to Mr. Thompson and back again. "Who are you?" Ethan finally turned to face her, his eyes cold as chips of ice. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the culmination of his plan, the final, devastating reveal. "You spent 10 years treating me like I was dirt under your shoe," he began, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. "You called me poor. You called me a parasite. You mocked my father, a man whose shoes none of you were worthy to shine." He took a step closer, and she instinctively recoiled. "You lived in this penthouse, drove your fancy cars, and wore your designer clothes, all while looking down on me. You thought your wealth made you better than me. You thought your power was absolute." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But what you didn't know," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "is that it was all a lie. Your wealth wasn't yours. It was a loan. Every dollar you ever spent, every deal you ever made, every brick in this building was financed by my family." Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Richard, who had been silent until now, shook his head in denial. "That's impossible. Our lender is North Star Investments." "A subsidiary," Ethan said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "A very small part of a much larger organization, an organization my family has owned for 200 years, an organization that I now control." He let that sink in. He watched the dawning horror spread across their faces as the full, catastrophic truth finally became clear. They hadn't just been cruel to the poor husband of their daughter. They had been biting the very hand that fed them, the hand that had built their entire world. You did this?" Seraphina whispered, her voice trembling. "The audit, the loan recall, Julian's job." "Every last bit of it," Ethan confirmed, a grim satisfaction in his tone. "You built your house on my family's foundation. I simply decided it was time for a renovation. You burned my clothes, so I burned your empire. It seems a fair trade." Seraphina finally broke. A terrible, guttural sob escaped her lips. She fell to her knees, the proud, arrogant woman reduced to a weeping mess on the floor. "Ethan, please," she begged, crawling towards him. Please, you can't do this. I love you, I always have. It was my family, they made me." Ethan looked down at her, his expression devoid of any pity. "No," he said, his voice cutting and final. "You never loved me. You loved the idea of having someone to look down on. Your love is as fake as your wealth." He turned his back on her and walked towards the door, Mr. Thompson falling into step beside him. Eleanor found her voice a screech of pure hatred. "You will pay for this. We will sue you. We will ruin you." Mr. Thompson paused and looked back at her, a look of mild amusement on his face. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you no longer have the resources to sue a parking attendant, let alone Mr. Miller. In fact, I believe the authorities will soon have some questions for your husband regarding several fraudulent loan applications. I would advise you to find a good public defender." With that, they were gone. Ethan walked out of the apartment and did not look back. He left the wreckage of the Montgomery family behind him, a mess of their own making. He stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, feeling as if a tremendous weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The epilogue of the Montgomerys was swift and brutal. Richard was arrested for fraud and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. Julian, disgraced and disbarred from the financial industry, ended up working a menial job, consumed by bitterness. Eleanor, forced to sell her jewelry and furs just to afford a small, run-down apartment, became a recluse, a ghost haunted by the memory of her lost status. Serafina fared the worst. Stripped of her wealth and social standing, she was abandoned by all her fair-weather friends, including her lover Marcus, who wanted nothing to do with a bankrupt divorcee. She tried to reach out to Ethan, sending desperate, pleading letters, but they were all returned unopened. Her fate was to live with the crushing knowledge that she had held unimaginable happiness and fortune in her hands and had thrown it all away out of pure, foolish arrogance. Ethan, however, did not embrace the life of a billionaire playboy. That was the Montgomerys' dream, not his. He remembered his father's lessons, the quiet dignity of a man who knew his own worth without needing to display it. With Mr. Thompson's guidance, he took control of the Vanguard Group, but he did so with a purpose. He started a massive philanthropic endeavor, the Miller Foundation, dedicated to funding vocational schools and providing grants for skilled artisans and ethical small businesses. He wanted to honor the carpenters, the builders, the honest workers of the world, people like his father. He lived modestly, preferring the quiet satisfaction of his work to the empty glamour of high society. He sold the penthouse and most of the other extravagant properties, investing the money back into the foundation. One day, while visiting a community workshop the foundation was funding, he met a woman named Clara. She was the project director, a warm, intelligent woman with a passion for her work and a kind smile. She didn't know who he was, only that he was a representative from the foundation. They talked for hours, not about money or status, but about craftsmanship, about community, about building something that lasts. For the first time in over a decade, Ethan felt a genuine connection with someone. He saw in her eyes the respect and admiration he had always craved, but never received from Serafina. Their relationship grew slowly, built on a foundation of shared values and mutual respect. He eventually told her the truth about his past and his inheritance. She was not impressed by the money, but by the man he had chosen to be in spite of it. Months later, Ethan stood with Clara on a bluff overlooking the ocean, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. He felt a sense of peace he had never known before. He had faced the worst of human cruelty and had emerged not bitter, but stronger. He had learned that true power was not in the billions of dollars in his bank account, but in the quiet confidence of knowing your own worth. True wealth was not measured in assets and luxury goods, but in integrity, purpose, and the love of a good person. The ghosts of his past were finally laid to rest. He was no longer the victim. He was the architect of his own life, building a future as solid and true as a joint crafted by his father's hands. And it was a future that was brighter than he could have ever imagined.